Is spending $800 for an upgrade too much? And for that money, how much performance can you actually expect to gain? The gaming handheld industry has a bit of a habit releasing half new products, which means instead of getting a whole new model, we get a small incremental update to existing models. And although they are considered improvements, they typically aren't significant or impactful enough to make the decision of upgrading an easy one. So in this video, I want to talk about the key differences between the ROG Ally and the ROG Ally X, and help you decide if it's worth upgrading to, or better yet, even worth buying at all. To do this, I'm going to split this video into three major buckets: usability, performance, and price. In each, I'll give you a direct side-by-side comparison along with some of my own personal opinions, having used both devices for an extended period of time. Do note that I'm using the Z1 Extreme model of the original Ally for this comparison. One of the first things many of you might have noticed with the original Ally was its shape. While smaller than most other handhelds, the Ally was particularly uncomfortable for a lot of people, myself included. What many of us figured out is that the Ally lends itself to being used while resting your wrists on a table. This, for whatever reason, is the optimal angle for holding the Ally. But if you're like the rest of us who like to game in bed or on the couch, or honestly anywhere not on a table, the Ally can quickly become uncomfortable to hold after 20 to 30 minutes. This is mainly due to the shape of the palm grips. The original Ally, as you can see, has very pronounced edges, giving it a very unique shape, which admittedly is very ROG, but ultimately ends up being uncomfortable to hold. The Ally X, on the other hand, moves away from this and instead offers a much more natural shape that's more form-fitting to your hands. This is ultimately going to boil down to your personal preference, but I think most people will absolutely prefer the ergonomics and shape of the Ally X, especially if you like to play for more than 45 minutes at a time. And while the Ally X is ever so slightly thicker and heavier than the Ally, it somehow doesn't make the device feel any bigger than the original. Rather, it makes it more comfortable and more substantial/premium feeling, which I think is an overall improvement. All that said, when it comes to controls, the Ally and Ally X are almost identical. The biggest difference you're going to notice immediately are the new rear buttons. The Ally has much larger, more intrusive rear buttons, which some of you might prefer. On the flip side, the Ally X has much smaller buttons that have seemingly moved further away, making the device more comfortable to hold, but slightly less accessible. For me personally, I've actually grown to prefer the Ally X rear buttons, as they're still within reach when I need them, but not in the way when I don't. I tested this extensively, as I had both tied to my dodge and jump keys in Elden Ring, so trust me when I say I've had more than enough time to see if these would work. Another difference you'll notice is in the triggers. The original Ally by far has the best triggers on a handheld. So, as you can imagine, I assumed the Ally X would be the same. And, well, they're not quite the same. As you can see, the Ally's triggers are more narrow and pointed, while the Ally X's are much wider and more round. They travel about the same distance and have about the same resistance, but just listen to the difference. As you can hear, the Ally has a much more satisfying stop at the furthest end, making them feel substantial, weighty, and satisfying, whereas the Ally X is a little more hollow and flat. Dare I say, a little flappy. At the end of the day, a minor change, but does sort of knock the experience of the X in my opinion. As for the shoulder buttons, the Allies are definitely less pronounced and feel more blended into the body, while the X has more pronounced shoulder buttons, but generally they feel the same, though I still prefer the Allies over the X's. The last thing I want to mention about the controls is the D-pad and the sticks. While both feel generally unchanged, the Ally X does get a slightly more concave shape in the sticks and a redesigned D-pad shape that honestly is going to come down to preference, as they both feel about the same. One important thing to note is that the material on the Ally X's D-pad is more of a matte plastic, while the original Ally has a more piano black glossy plastic. One area that did change on the Ally X was the top I/O area. As you can see, ASUS reorganized a lot of the I/O on the Ally X to both accommodate the new screen vent and the new USB 4 port that replaced the old XG mobile port. As far as usability is concerned, they're functionally the same, with the exception that the Ally X can now support 2 USB-C peripherals, including eGPUs. Not only that, but both USB ports on the X support power delivery up to 100 watts, giving you the ability to quickly charge the Ally X's new 80 watt-hour battery, but we'll talk more about the battery in the performance section. Needless to say, I definitely prefer the Ally X's I/O simply for the extra USB port, which also supports Thunderbolt 4, making it ideal not only for external displays, but also external GPUs, much like the original XG Mobile port on the Ally. Besides the USB ports, the Ally X has all the same stuff on the top, and apparently even a new SD card reader that hopefully doesn't fry your SD cards. Though I have yet to test it myself because the Ally X comes standard with 1 terabyte of NVMe storage, but if you stick around, I'll have a full review of the Ally X soon, so make sure to get subscribed and hit the notification bell to be notified once it's up. Overall, as far as usability goes and whether you should upgrade, it's really going to boil down to whether or not you're unhappy with the ergonomics of your current Ally. If the shape and size don't bother you, then the Ally X isn't going to be worth it, especially if you like the larger rear buttons and prefer the triggers on the original Ally. But if you're like me and had some fatigue holding the Ally, which led you to using it less, then the Ally X absolutely fixes everything that felt wrong about the original Ally and does make it more comfortable to hold for much longer periods of time. That and the extra USB-C port is really nice if you like to use other accessories while you charge. Now, most of you know by now, I don't normally do benchmarks on this channel, but for this section, I'll show some direct side-by-side performance numbers so you can get an idea whether the Ally X performs any better than the original Ally. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Ally X is using the same AMD Z1 Extreme chip as the Ally, but does have a couple of slight upgrades. The Ally X now has 24 gigabytes of RAM at 7,500 megatransfers per second compared to the Ally's 16 gigabytes at 6,400 megatransfers per second. What really matters here is that due to the way the Z1 Extreme functions on the Allies, the added 8 gigabytes of RAM allows for the Ally X to reserve a full 16 gigabytes for the system while allocating the remaining 8 gigabytes to the GPU. We know this because out of the box, the Ally X will have 8 gigabytes dedicated to the GPU while the Ally only has 4. This, in conjunction with the higher speed, allows the Ally X to better handle things like higher quality textures more efficiently, which can be a slight performance boost in some titles. Can't say it's been a noticeable difference to me, but there is technically a boost in performance if you look hard enough. Now, given both Allies use the same APU and screen, you really shouldn't expect a whole lot here. For the comparison, I decided to use Cyberpunk 2077 for the top end and Vampire Survivors as the low end to sort of cover the wide spectrum of different games you might play. Starting off with performance mode. Overall, gameplay felt about the same on both systems. At best, the Ally X showed a marginal 2 to 5 FPS advantage over the original Ally, likely because, again, the X runs at 17 watts in performance mode instead of 15 like the original Ally. What was more interesting is that the Ally X actually ran about 3 to 4 degrees Celsius cooler than the original Ally despite drawing more power. Neither system particularly gets hot while gaming in my experience, but I'm willing to bet the tiny vent at the top of the Ally X's screen does help reduce a little bit of the heat when under load. All in all, both systems managed about 20 to 30 FPS while in performance mode, with the occasional bump to 35 FPS in certain areas. Moving over to turbo mode now evens the playing field by providing both systems 30 watt of power, which in turn boosts our FPS about 10 to 15, putting us at that nice sweet spot between 35 and 45 FPS with the occasional bump to over 50 in certain areas. As expected, in this mode both systems performed identically. While the X does have that faster memory, you'd be hard pressed to notice the difference. Does it add performance somewhere? Probably. Is it going to be something you feel while gaming? No. I emphasize gaming because no one's actually thinking about performance while gaming unless it directly impacts their gameplay. And in this case, the faster RAM on the Ally X didn't impact my experience in really any noticeable way. Now we'll throw on Vampire Survivors. But this time, we're using silent mode, which you'll notice is now 13 watts on the Ally X as opposed to 10 watts on the Ally. Obviously, both these systems are going to run games like this capped at 120 FPS at 1080p without much problem at all. So you'll virtually see no performance difference at a certain point, especially for lower end titles. However, what's more important here is the battery performance. As many of you already know, the original Ally comes with a 40 watt hour battery and the Ally X has a whopping 80 watt hour battery. Now, normally, just because a battery has double the capacity doesn't always mean it has double the performance. But in the case of the Ally X, we do actually see more than double the battery life in most cases. This is likely why both silent and performance mode got a baseline power target bump in the Ally X over the original Ally. Interestingly enough, the Ally X actually operates more efficiently than the original Ally, allowing it to better utilize its power without using as much battery. Couple that with the much larger capacity and voila, more than double the battery life. But for fun, here's a time lapse of both systems running Cyberpunk 2077 in performance mode on battery, just so you can see how much longer the Ally X lasts when running alongside the original Ally. Both systems were using their default performance modes, CPU boost disabled, and brightness at 50%. In-game, both systems are using the Steam Deck preset with FSR enabled on balance mode at 1080p. After just 30 minutes, the original Ally was already down to 66%, while the X was at 87%. An hour later, and the original Ally was already approaching low battery territory at 28%, while the X was comfortably sitting at 71%. And at 1 hour and 20 minutes, the original Ally gave up and shut down. Not too bad. Except the Ally X was still at nearly 60%. Even after 2 whole hours, the Ally X was still over 30%. That's actually insane for a handheld. And then finally, at almost 3 hours, the Ally X finally called it quits and died. If you had any doubt whether this battery really makes a difference, I'd say the battery performance alone is enough to warrant an upgrade if you're someone who frequently plays their handheld as opposed to their desktop. I'd be willing to go as far to say that the battery on the Ally X is the best upgrade we've seen, not only in the Ally, but on a handheld period. Now, one other thing to consider when it comes to performance is actually the SSD. Most of you probably bought your Ally thinking, sick, I'll just toss in a 1TB micro SD card and call it a day. And well, most of us know how that turned out. And yeah, you could just upgrade the internal SSD on the original Ally, but the Ally X not only comes standard with 1TB of storage, it now uses the M.2 2280 standard, making it easier to find replacements and higher capacity drives for much more reasonable prices. Although, to be honest, I found that 1TB for a handheld is sort of the sweet spot, at least for me. In any case, it is something to consider if you had issues with your SD slot in the past and simply don't want to fuss with upgrades or expandable storage. Overall, the performance between the Ally and the Ally X is slim at best. But when viewed under a microscope, the Ally X does come through with some slight edges, but generally speaking, the overall quality of the performance between the two is about the same. Now, the battery, on the other hand, that's going to be the deciding factor when it comes to performance. Do you find yourself running out of battery constantly? Or like me, do you avoid playing games like Cyberpunk on the go because you know it's not really worth the 1 hour playtime? Then the Ally X is absolutely worth the upgrade. On the flip side, if you prefer indie titles and find that you don't really use your handheld all that much because you have a desktop, then you're not missing anything with the Ally X. Games play and feel the same for the most part, especially indie games. So if your battery life isn't causing a problem, don't upgrade. So that then leaves us with the price. Now, at the time of writing this, the ROG Ally can be found at numerous places for about $600 brand new. Keep in mind, there is a cheaper version of the Ally that uses the less extreme AMD Z1 chip. That being said, this entire comparison is based off the Z1 Extreme model. So just putting that out there in case you think you found a sick deal on Amazon for a $480 Ally and you inevitably get disappointed when you find out you bought the wet blanket edition. So yeah, don't do that. Anyway, I think the original Ally is priced pretty well given it plays games just as well as the X, has 512 gigabytes of storage, and shares a lot of similarities with the X at a cheaper price. Even compared to a Steam Deck OLED, the original Ally still feels like a great deal in 2024, assuming newer batches have solved the SD card slot issue and you're willing to deal with Windows. But what about the X then? Well, the ROG X is $800 brand new at the time of writing this, which is really starting to approach the point where you have to ask yourself, is it even worth it? Some of you might remember my review of the Aya Neo 2S, which was over $1,000 for effectively the same performance as an Ally. So $800 is kind of a sharp point in this whole discussion. Now, if you plan to trade in or sell your original Ally for, say, $400 or so, okay, that starts to make sense. But even if you could get an Ally X for $400, I'm not entirely sold on the idea that it's worth upgrading to if your current Ally doesn't actually give you any issue. You see, for a long time, I often would make the mistake of upgrading to each iterative device because, well, bigger number mean more performance and better quality, right? But over time, I began to realize that what matters more than slight spec bumps is how I use my devices. So if you're currently stuck deciding whether you should run out and buy the Ally X, ask yourself this: do I ever use my Ally? Or do I just want a new toy to play with because it's exciting? Both are totally valid, by the way. But this way of thinking will help you determine if getting the X will ultimately be worth it to you for the right reasons. Value is subjective, and I can only show you the facts while providing my own experience. If you ask me, I think for most original Ally owners, it's not going to be worth the upgrade unless the extra battery and other improvements will genuinely make you want to use your Ally more than you already do and remove restrictions that would otherwise make using your Ally difficult or annoying. Alternatively, my biggest advice is to not pay for potential. If you never use your Ally because you already have a gaming PC or simply just don't have time to game, getting an Ally X isn't going to change that. For context, I have an original Nintendo Switch, and I have never upgraded to the OLED Switch simply because I don't actually use my Switch, but maybe once or twice a year, and getting the OLED model, while a reasonable improvement, simply isn't going to make me want to use my Switch any more than I already do. So I never upgraded and saved myself about $350. The same can be said for the Ally, or really any upgrade. TLDR, upgrade for the battery if nothing else, but be prepared to drop $800 to either A, get way more use out of your handheld, or B, spend $800 for the peace of mind knowing you could get more use out of your handheld if you actually decided to use it. One of those options doesn't actually cost $800. But that's gonna be it for this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to hit the like button, and as always, make sure to get subscribed to see more content like this. You can follow us on all the major platforms at XXIV_concept. And I'll see you guys in the full review of the ROG Ally X. This is my plant, Harold. Do you guys like my plant, Harold? Look how beautiful he is. No more fake tech plants. It's all about real tech plants now.